everyone, and thank you for joining the first Cubinar of 2024, an engaging and innovative online event hosted by Rancilio Cube CCAF. And this format is designed to offer deep dives into the remarkable journeys of general partners and founders within the Rancilio Cube's investment portfolio, shedding light on their strategies, innovations, and the success stories that have propelled their funds or companies forward. I'm Ines Macula, and I'm today's moderator and the host of Made It Podcast, one of the leading entrepreneurship podcasts in Italy. Along with my co-host Camilla Scasellati, we interview every week entrepreneurs and investors to share their stories in a very candid and personal way to uncover what really lies behind their success. So I'm excited to be here today to get us through this conversation with two incredible guests. We have Francesco Sciortino, the co-founder and CEO of Proxima Fusion, and Sebastian Pollok, the founding partner of Visionaries Club and Tomorrow. They will both share their insights from their exceptional careers and the groundbreaking work that their companies are doing. Francesco is a visionary in the field of fusion energy. His research has brought him through some of the world's most prestigious institutions, including Imperial College, EPFL, Princeton, and MIT, where he completed his Ph.D. on fusion energy. His deep-rooted passion for clean and sustainable energy solutions led him to co-found Proxima Fusion. Proxima is the first fusion company to spin out of Germany's revered Max Planck Institute for Plasma Physics. It has secured a 7.5 million euro pre-seed round backed by Tomorrow, of which Rancilio Cube has invested in, as well as funds like Plural Platform and UVC Partners to develop their QI stellarator. We'll ask Francesco to explain what the stellarator means and everything, but it's a revolutionary fusion energy machine that aims to provide a future source of abundant emission-free power. And under his leadership, Proxima Fusion has grown into a team of around 30 engineers and physicists dedicated to making continuous operation fusion energy a reality. And we have also Sebastian Pollok, a trailblazer in the venture capital landscape. Sebastian is the founding partner of Visionaries Club, a venture capital fund in the B2B SaaS space that enjoys backing from some of the most successful unicorn founders and family entrepreneurs. He recently launched Tomorrow, a fund that specializes in climate deep tech. And he was previously co-founder and co-CEO of AMORELIE, which successfully exited in 2018. His commitment to fostering innovation extends to his role on the board of the German Startup Association, where he contributes to shaping the future of startups in Germany. But before I get started with the interview, I wanted to let you know that you can ask questions using the StreamYard chat function. And we will pick your questions. We will leave the last 15 minutes of the session for your questions. So please don't be shy. Ask away all of your questions. And without further ado, let's just jump into this conversation. Francesco, I wanted to start with you. I wanted to ask you, what inspired you to transition from academic research to entrepreneurship in the fusion energy sector? And how was the idea of Proxima Fusion born?
Thanks for the question and for the nice introduction. In my case, it wasn't that I was born to be an entrepreneur, let's say. It's not necessarily the background I come from, but there was a need for a group of people to actually break some ice and get out of the Max Planck Society, leveraging the incredible know-how of the institute that we came out from. The Max Planck Institute for Plasma Physics has been doing fusion for 60 years, has 1,100 people that study magnetic confinement systems. And coming from having done my PhD and also my co-founder Lucio, we were both at MIT when the now largest fusion company on the planet spun out of MIT. That company is called Commonwealth Fusion Systems, has raised $2 billion and is building a real device that we actually think is very interesting. We thought that while the team based in Boston of CFS, as the name goes in short, while that team is fantastic, we think that we can leverage a different approach to fusion that is more coherent, that we think is more promising. So we had it all in some sense. We had the entrepreneurial vibe, the feeling that we wanted to change something, and we put together the puzzle pieces. We had this advantage of stellarators in Germany. If you don't know what a stellarator is, the name suggests something like a star. In some sense, we're trying to make a star in the laboratory. And that means taking hot ionized matter, putting into a cube of some sort in the form of a donut, or you could call it a donut or an apple, depending on your imagination. And you're trying to confine this hot ionized matter at 100 million degrees with magnetic fields. And this stellarator is a kind of design that is a wonderful German story, you might say, and that's why we are in Germany as a team. If you Google W7X, that stands for Wendelstein 7X. That's a device that you have to look at a picture, otherwise I can't describe this. It's an incredible device that costed 1.3 billion of public investment. And this was really inspiring for us. We said we have the opportunity. What we are missing is some sort of lack of risk aversion that is so common in Europe. We felt like times had changed, and so we jumped.
Fantastic. I was going to ask you to explain what the stellarator was in simple terms, but I think you did it already. Could you just walk us through what problem Proxima Fusion is trying to solve?
Yeah, so this device, the stellarator, is a computationally enabled kind of device. So it's a machine that only in the 90s we started really understanding how to optimize. So imagine you're trying to create magnetic fields with a rather complicated geometry, and the details in that geometry make a massive difference. The matter that we are trying to confine and keep away from any materials has this energy is so high that you have to control it really carefully or you will damage some materials. It's all wonderfully safe, fusion, unlike fission. So that's one of the beautiful things about fusion, but it's very, very hard. So while fusion can be, it's the reason why we're chasing it for so long is that it's clean, it's safe, it's abundant in its fuels. It has it all, but it's just very hard. In the case of stellarators, you have to use as many advanced optimization tools, artificial intelligence, whatever you have to come up with this beautiful geometry. And then you actually also have to build it. And building this is something we can do in Europe much better than in the US. So the team of Proxima is split between doing device optimization and then high temperature superconducting magnets. So it's both software and hardware with a strength on engineering design.
Thank you. Thank you for walking us through it for us that are not like super into the details of the tech.
Honestly, a picture is much more valuable than my words. So I encourage everyone to actually look online what a stellarator is, and you'll find W7X, which is an interesting thing. Yeah.
And Sebastian, can you tell us why did you decide to launch Tomorrow, your fund focused on climate deep tech? And can you give us also an overview of the size of the fund and in which companies you've invested so far?
Of course. And first of all, thank you so much for the invite, both to you, Ines, also to Luca and the team. So Tomorrow, I can give a very long answer to this because it comes straight from the heart and the head, actually, which is something that I really like. But in very short, as a short answer, we all know that the climate crisis, it is one of the largest challenges that humanity has ever faced. And I actually, as an entrepreneur, and you talked about my life so far. So I've not always been an investor. So I actually started as an entrepreneur and then turned to the dark side and became an investor. But, the larger problem is the more I get excited about it. And I think there's a tendency for people to kind of run away from fires, whereas an entrepreneur actually turns towards it. And Francesco has actually picked one of the hottest and largest fires out there and is trying to find a solution for it. And what excites us about that, and that's what we have ingrained into the strategy of Tomorrow, is that we feel that, the larger the problem, the bigger the solution will be. So to us, this is actually one of the once in a lifetime investing and impact opportunities. So we feel that you can actually, if you dare investing into the large potential solutions to this gigantic human planet crisis of climate change, then you are actually able to get superior returns if you're willing to take the risk. We are willing to take the risk. And at the same time, it's also, Steve Jobs would call it kind of this dent in the universe, this impact opportunity. So I have a 2.5-year-old son, and he's my daily reminder of why I'm also doing this. So that's kind of the short story of why we decided to launch tomorrow. And what we're then bringing to the table is what we've built with Visionaries Club. So for those who don't know Visionaries Club, and Rancilio Cube is one of the early backers, has been one of the early backers of Visionaries Club. So we bring, on the one hand, family businesses and industrial giants together with unicorn founders. And then with that very unique group of fund investors, we then try to help our portfolio companies, to put it in a nutshell. So that means deep industrial access on the one hand, and pretty much world-leading scaling know-how on the other hand. And that's how we started Visionaries Club a couple of years ago, and that's how we now have also launched tomorrow with that very USP, but now fully focused on climate deep tech. And the fund will be 80 million in total. So we will do the final closing at the end of the year. And we've done the first 4 investments ever since we did our first closing in December of last year. So Proxima is one of them. Then we invested into Cosmic Aerospace, which is an electric aviation company. So trying to revolutionize how we're actually flying. And then there are 2 other companies that are still in stealth mode. One is in the grid scale energy storage sector, and the other one is in, say, green ammonia, so green fertilizer. How do you actually produce fertilizer without using this outdated, very energy inefficient and fossil intensive Haber-Bosch process that's currently being used?
It's amazing to see these businesses that are really trying to, like, as you said before, solve the world's biggest problems. And how, from the perspective of the Tomorrow Fund, what potential did you see in Proxima Fusion that really aligned with your investment strategy?
We are very hypothesis driven. So in this case, an in-depth look at the energy market and also at the problems that the energy market is currently facing pretty much brought us, very, very broadly speaking, to the topic of fusion, and then pretty much taking a look at the different companies we then decided to invest in Proxima and into Francesco's team. And what that looks like is that when I talk about hypothesis-driven, this hypothesis-driven top-down approach, is that in this case, there is one critical need, which is that we need to decarbonize the baseload electricity supply. So pretty much what is currently being supplied mainly by coal plants, for example, we need to get rid of that in order to decarbonize electricity generation. Right now, 40% of greenhouse gases that are emitted in electricity production are actually coming, for example, from coal. So in order to do that, we need to reduce to zero, ideally, the emissions of power generation, and renewable energy sources will not get us there. Renewable energy sources are great for lots of things, but they're not great at steady output of electricity. As we are all unfortunately aware, the sun doesn't always shine. Even if you're in Italy, it doesn't always shine. There's this thing called a night. So you can't produce solar energy at night. Wind is also not always blowing. So we need this stable amount of energy, and that's what's called baseload electricity. And yeah, that's kind of how we came about this general hypothesis that we need to look at fusion. And then with Proxima itself, you're now meeting Francesco, so I think he's next to Lucio and the other team members. He is one of the very reasons to invest in this company. The other one was also already mentioned. It's the first ever Max Planck spin-off. So within this IPP, the Institute for Plasma Physics, which is really one of the world's leading institutes for this space, and having already built the Wendelstein 7X, which Francesco already mentioned, those are incredible assets. And now using that to commercialize this technology it is something that really convinced us. And ultimately, if you look at it from a very broad point of view, and this is the last part of my answer here, is so fusion would be and kind of in capital letters, the answer to one of humanity's biggest problems. How do we get clean, safe, and abundant energy? So that's why we invested.
Thank you. I always like to ask this question on the podcast, and it was great to hear from you. Usually we don't have the investor and the entrepreneur in the room, so it's great to have you together and hear both your point of views. And Francesco, how does Proxima Fusion's approach to fusion energy innovate within your sector, and what impact do you foresee on global energy solutions? Will this become the new electricity at some point? Like, it would be great to see what the vision is.
Yeah. So as Sebastian was saying, what we're targeting is the base load, or you could also say the load following. So base load meaning the one source of energy, electricity, also storage capacity, let's say, something that fuels also the batteries. Everything you've got, you need that substitute for coal and gas eventually. To get there are multiple approaches that you can target. There are now more than 50 fusion companies, most of them in the United States. And the US ecosystem of fusion, it turns out not to be stronger on a scientific side, but definitely more entrepreneurial. And this is hardly surprising, maybe. So the risk aversion in Europe has created this situation where Europe actually has quite a step above the US research ecosystem. But we haven't quite been the most proactive in actually leveraging that and bringing it to commercialization. So of course, everyone needs to assess what are the different approaches to fusion, and it's totally okay to disagree on what eventually will scale and what not. There are very different opinions in the field. The most conventional approach to fusion is the one that is called a tokamak. And this tokamak is not so unlike a stellarator. It's still a donut shaped, but it's easier in design, but much harder to operate. For context, I was doing research. I did my PhD in tokamaks. They are conventional for good reasons, because they are easier in some way to do experiments with. But I myself became convinced that they are not the answer. I was European coordinator for one of the European coordinators for tokamak research for some time. And rather than keeping on going in that direction, decided that the stellarator is a better path. So if we succeed at optimizing a so-called QI stellarator, so a subcategory of stellarators, and we manage to scale this technology, so not only build not only the plasma, but the magnets, the structures, the ways to absorb the neutrons, all of it, then the point is not to build a stellarator. Of course, you want to start building hundreds of stellarators. To really make a dent in the energy supply, you really need to get to, there are 2,432 coal power plants around the world, last time I checked. And the objective should be that we go and replace them all. So as Proxima Fusion, our objective is to create the technology core that you could substitute to the coal or gas fired power plants. And if you look at any reasonable predictions of what the net zero European grid looks like in 2050, as of today, it says that it will not be net zero, first of all. So it's a bit of a tricky situation. There is not much reason to think that the renewables, the intermittent photovoltaics, solar, hydro, and whatnot, that they will actually be able to scale beyond some fraction of the grid. So 75% can be taken by photovoltaics, pretty much. That's great. We should totally do that. But that baseload part that Sebastian was mentioning, that's what we're targeting, and we need it if we actually are serious about those climate targets.
Amazing. And as you said, I imagine that when you say that something is very, very hard to build, it's also very, very expensive, probably. So with the 7.5 million euros that you raised in your pre-seed, how are you planning to use the funds how are you planning to use the funds to get to the next stage?
I'm sure that this does not come as a surprise to Sebastian, but we are spending them very quickly. In fact, Sebastian knows that we have been working on a new fundraising, and we've been pleasantly surprised at the speed at which we've moved over the past year. So we are just about to announce public funding that we have received from the German government, as well as a new private funding. This is still relatively small compared to the scale of what we're talking about. It should be understood. So there are fusion companies, and not only fusion, that portray themselves and fusion as a whole as a quick solution to climate change. This is not the picture that I would like to give. Fusion is should be thought of as the ultimate solution for clean energy. And this is not happening tomorrow. Our timescale to actually come to market, let's say it's between 10 and 15 years. So it requires us to build an intermediate device that we see ourselves building in Munich. Current target date is 2031. And then if we succeed at that by 2035, 2036, to be determined, that is the timescale by which we can build the first of a kind fusion power plant. How much does that cost? The kinds of technology milestones, both in terms of engineering design and hardware manufacturing of these superconducting magnets, that give or take requires 100 million euros. That's the order of magnitude, let's say. And to actually build a device, a stellarator that shows net energy production in steady state, there we're going towards the 500 million euros. If you manage to then scale that we're talking about gigawatt scale systems. And maybe that's what everyone has to tune to, because when you hear the first time 500 million euros, you're like, it sounds pretty nuts. And then you realize how much it costs to make 1 gigawatt of gas. That's about 3 to 6 billion standard. And if you look at how much it is to make a gigawatt of fission, so nuclear as we know it, that depends on the regulation, but it tends to be above 10 billion. So if you really manage to make a fusion power plant, gigawatt scale, and you manage to be in the order of billion, the water split up and you get to walk to clean energy. Let's put it that way. That's the target.
Yes. No, it's great to hear the magnitude of what you actually need to really make a difference in the world. And actually tomorrow I'm interviewing the founder of Nucleo, which is nuclear energy. And they raised $1 billion, to try and solve the problem. So, I mean, it's an industry that requires a lot. And so you also need funds, I guess, that are very long-term, and investors that are very long-term within
that's a challenge with energy. Production of energy, actually, if you look at how many startups are really being created on energy production, there is fantastic activity on energy storage. And Sebastian already mentioned some of the companies that are really great teams in the Tomorrow Fund. There is good activity on the storage side, but actual energy production, there aren't that many innovative solutions that are coming out. Fusion is a clear one. There is the Nuclear Group is doing fantastic progress on new approaches to fission. The innovation space for photovoltaics has been reducing. Now we are really in the phase of the S-curve of exploitation and further development, but we shouldn't be expecting groundbreaking discoveries as far as I know. So if we really need a completely different solution, we should sort of scale our ambition to the fact that energy is pretty radical as a change for humanity. It takes time and funding.
Absolutely. And Sebastian, from an investor's perspective, what challenges do you encounter when you're backing deep tech startups, and how do you address them?
So maybe let me start with what I really love about this investing in this space. And I started out as an investor in San Francisco 15 years ago. So for the past 15 years, I've looked at many different types of companies, many different verticals actually, and also many companies outside of the deep tech space. So sometimes as an investor, you have to ask yourself, what is the problem exactly that this company is trying to solve here? And you don't really get to the answer that easily. You have to dig deep and you have to try to understand, and then you're still not sure how pressing that problem really is. What Francesco and the team is building, what the other companies in our portfolio are building, and what they're trying to solve, that doesn't need any explanation. The tech may need explanation, but the problem is always very apparent, very clear, very obvious. So that's the one thing I really love. So you don't have that much market risk, let's put it this way. But of course, and now getting to the challenges, you have engineering risk. So whereas for a typical, say, software as a service company, it's rather easy to build the product, but then it may be hard to actually commercialize it and to really become a market leader. I think here it's a little bit the opposite. So it's harder to build the product, but then once you've managed to do it, then you may end up being a monopolist or an oligopolist, and the demand is there. So that's something that on the one hand is a challenge, but at the same time, it's a big plus. The other aspect that Francesco also mentioned is time to market. So you go from an idea to prototype to first of a kind to then commercial scale. And for us, how we work with our LPs, so with our fund investors, with those industrial giants of today and the unicorn founders, the 45 plus unicorn founders who backed us as a fund, is that especially there we're trying to be very supportive in opening doors that otherwise wouldn't be open. So we're trying to arrange for early technology partnerships. We're trying to kind of accelerate the track to the commercialization phase. And that's how we have a significant edge over, let's say, other funds in the space, that we have this unfair access to the industrial world and to the unicorn scaling world.
And given that you're investing in highly technical businesses, obviously you see the market, the problem, you can evaluate the founder, but when it comes to evaluating the technology that you're building, how do you do it? What are some of the things that you do to make sure that an investment is worth it?
Yeah, it's a very detailed process. So I'm not going to go into the detailed process, but let me highlight 4 areas. So one, it's very much about this building strong hypotheses within key industries that we're interested in, oftentimes with the help of our industrial LPs or with the help of our industrial fund investors. And then, we do those landscape exercises where we then talk to every company in a particular space that we find interesting. And and then we end up with a company that we think stands out, where we see the potential to actually become a multi-billion-dollar company. And then we spend a lot of time with the founders, and we try to do it in person as much as possible. So traveling to Munich to meet the team. My co-founder Tong is in Munich, so that was obviously already an advantage, but I hopped on a train, and then we spent lots of time with Francesco and the team. And on the team side, it's really about finding obsessed founders, obsessed about solving this problem, combining science, industry, and commercial know-how, and having this long-term focus. So I'm not sure how public you are about this, Francesco, but for example, the internal team, the equity vesting, so the time that you need to actually have full ownership of shares at Proxima Fusion is longer than market standard by default, by definition, by design, because Francesco and the team, they wanted it to be that way because they knew from day one that they're in this for the long run, and they only want people to be part of the team who understand that. And we love that, for example. Then 3, we look very deep into the technology. We can also, once again, do that with the help of our industrial fund investors, but we also do it with our, say, science partners in our scientific network. And we also do it with the in-team experience that we have. My co-founder Tong spent the last 10 years at Fraunhofer, so Europe's largest applied research institution. He co-built their deep tech fund, and all the other team members, they're also Cambridge engineering, Technical University of Munich engineering grad. So it's I'm the odd one out, where I come from a very scientific family, and I've always loved it. But I doubled down on this other passion business for a long time, and now I'm back to the roots. And number 4, to wrap it up, obviously is market. So speaking to lots of potential customers, getting market feedback. Those are pretty much the large 4 areas, and ultimately we are always looking for category creators. So we always call it era-defining companies. So we're really into those large potential, those large companies that redefine paradigms and that will completely change how we live, just like Proxima Fusion will one day.
Well, thank you for sharing. It's really interesting, especially because in the startup world, everything goes so fast, right? You see companies, that are exiting 2 or 3 years after their first initial funding. And it's interesting to see a sector that actually does not play by those rules. And you also have to keep the founders motivated for 10, 15 years, right? So it's interesting, the vesting program that you have. And also it is very different from a lot of maybe B2B SaaS companies that you've probably invested in the past. And Francesco, how has the support from investors like the Tomorrow Fund, and indirectly Rancilio Cube, who invested in Tomorrow, contributed to shaping the strategic direction of Proxima Fusion?
In the early days, we started looking for mostly operational investors. So in the case of Sebastian and the Tomorrow Fund, we looked for people that we wanted to go for a beer with. First point. So people that we wanted to ask advice to. It helps if there is an extra angle, if the investor has also expertise as having been a founder. You feel the difference, and in some cases. In the case of Sebastian, of course, they have a very nice office in Berlin, which I like to go by when I happen to be in Berlin. Of course,
Francesco actually has a key. I'm not sure if you still have it, but had a key to the office. So that's as far as it goes.
And of course, the network of investors is also very helpful for a startup. So the Proxima Group came out of scientists and engineers, not of a group. We are a group of first-time founders. And so looking for investors that really can reflect on that and understand what you're missing before sometimes you know it, it helps. Network means both connections to new investors, which of course becomes more and more important as we try to scale. Right now, we don't have the trouble of not having interest from investors. But then as we raise more and more capital, of course, that becomes a greater problem, more of a concern in a European venture capital system. But network also means with policymakers. In the case of Fusion, if you ask what is the regulation that applies to those power plants that we're trying to build, it's still being defined. So we have to do actually a lot of interesting work to actually shape the whole field. So truly multifaceted as a kind of problem that we have. And Sebastian, for example, is very nicely networked in the Berlin ecosystem, and other investors that are related to Proxima Fusion in the Munich ecosystem, in London, or in the US. Everyone, we're looking for people that each contribute proactively. That is a very important aspect to the story. Sometimes, as I said, I don't even know exactly what I need to ask to an investor. So it really helps if the investor can see the opportunity and understand, because they've been following the updates that we send to our investors. All of these parts.
Very interesting. And Sebastian, you've mentioned a few things already before of how you support the startups. Obviously, you have a really large network of investors that you can open doors for potential collaborations. Is there anything else, obviously, in addition to the money, which always is a necessary thing, but is there anything else as an investor, as a fund Tomorrow? Is there anything else you do to support the startup?
I would say so. We're founders ourselves. I think that's a big difference. Francesco just mentioned it. Then it is that leveraging the network part, deep industrial connections, the entrepreneurial connections. How do you actually scale a company? Ultimately, you're always building an organization. It doesn't matter if you're building a fusion organization or if you're building an electric aviation organization. You always have to do amazing hiring. You have to do amazing goal setting. The world's best Monday morning kickoffs. Everyone is excited for the week, and being able to tap into the knowledge of 45 plus unicorn founders who've all invested. That's something unheard of. And then it's follow-on funding. It's those connections to not only the typical investors, the VCs, but also, especially when I take a look at our fund investor base, we have some very deep pockets on the side of the family business owners who have invested in the fund, and they're all very keen to do co-investments or follow-on investments. So that's a rough look at how we work.
I think it's very long term, and especially in this space, as we were mentioning, you need also the investors that are willing to go. Just wanted to mention, thank you all for the questions. We are going to get to them towards in the next 10 minutes, but thank you so much for, I'm seeing lots of questions coming through. Francesco, looking ahead now, what are the next big milestones for Proxima?
So now that we have recently completed a new fundraise and we are receiving some public funding, we are going through a pretty steep acceleration. We are just about to submit a set of publications that will describe what we have achieved in terms of optimization of stellarators and an engineering concept for what a power plant looks like, in our opinion. And that will sort of set us, as we think, the leading stellarator company on the planet. Then getting more and more into the hardware. Right now, we are prototyping in the lab with industrial partners here in the Bavarian ecosystem. We are going to expand that. And the real major inflection point, you could say, in the story of Proxima is the development of a non-planar high-temperature superconducting magnet. So that's a new kind of superconducting magnet. That means a kind of magnet that you have to cool down to very low temperatures. And when you do it right, there is no resistance, so no losses, and you can create really high magnetic fields. If you manage to do that in a magnet that has the shape that is right for a stellarator, we think that makes all of the difference. And this will be the most powerful magnet on the planet by some margin. So that's really a piece of technology that is the fusion motivates, but that actually would have applications in a number of other domains. Our focus is getting it to the energy market, so via stellarator power plants. But actually, fusion is sort of a technology platform, you could say, particularly through magnets. So that we're targeting by mid-2026. By early 2027, we hope to have a critical engineering design review for the stellarator we want to build, and then off to actually building the device.
And looking back on your journey so far, what has been like the biggest obstacle and maybe the biggest success that you've achieved so far?
Biggest obstacle is, I could just summarize, I could just say the technical stuff that we're trying to do is not easy, but maybe that's avoiding the question to some extent. I think fighting the inertia of our ecosystem, both academic and industrial, and taking the lead as a startup and sort of trying to shake up a few things, it's harder than optimizing stellarators, I dare say, in the sense that you have to deal with a lot of human conditions that can be enabling. If you manage to bring a number of partners, academic, policymakers, and of course an engineering team, that's much more powerful than you can do alone. Biggest success is very easy instead. It's bringing together this team of 30 people, each of which is an expansion in a new dimension. So we've been extremely successful in hiring. I think that's the single clearest metric of our success so far. I do encourage anyone to go and check them on LinkedIn. You'll be amazed.
Must be like the most brilliant minds all together. And that's for sure like something, especially a startup at an early stage, it makes the world of a difference. You can be very well funded, but to have a stellar team is what's going to make the difference. So that's amazing that you've been able to attract so many incredible talents. And Sebastian, based on your experience, what key advice would you offer investors that are new to the deep tech or clean energy space?
So Reid Hoffman, the founder of LinkedIn, he calls it reverse anthropology. So and we do the same. We try to look into the future and try to imagine what the future will look like, and then pretty much derive and build investment hypotheses from there. So I would say that's where I would typically start, because you're not investing in the today, but you are investing in the tomorrow, and actually a few more days ahead of that. Then I mean, there are countless experiences and lessons that we've learned. I would say it's very much about creating a repeatable investment decision process. So you also learn from bad decisions that you've made in the past. You can at some point you can get to a more structured view of the world the more you repeat this process. I would look at it differently than from a SaaS, so software as a service perspective, where it's very metrics driven. Here it's very much about this reverse anthropology. It's about looking at the technical status quo or the technology status quo right now and taking a look at what the company is doing, then figuring out how that can actually move the world forward. Yeah, and then countless other things that we take a look at on a daily basis. There are some investors in the clean energy or deep tech space that invest in companies where, in order for the companies to be successful, you actually need to believe in a green premium, so that consumers, for example, are actually willing to spend more money on the same product, but it's derived from a different clean or green source. We're not big believers in that, so we always call it the Mr. Burns test. You may remember from The Simpsons this Manchester capitalist, the iconic capitalist, and we want to back companies that Mr. Burns would also use, that he would also invest in. So, for example, with Proxima, the ultimate idea is that this is a source of energy which is actually abundant, which is clean and safe, and which is also at same or even lower prices than current energy supply.
And a question for both of you: could you share some insights, strategies that have been particularly effective for fostering successful relationship between investor and an entrepreneur or startup? Because I'm sure, Sebastian, you've seen a lot, a good relationship. You might have experienced some not so good ones, and maybe Francesco, I don't know if maybe you got along with all of your investors, but anything that you can share to make the relationship strong, it's very important. If you have any tips.
Sebastian, you want to kick off?
I would say open communication, brutal honesty, trying to identify where the support is needed the most, and also being very cognizant of where I should just shut up.
I think that's one of the elements that a founder understands better than most. You understand as a founder that sometimes there is the same information coming from multiple people, and then you don't need it as a founder again. So having that openness, radical candor, let's say, in saying, thanks, this is a great moment. I need you now. And now it's instead, I'm fine. This is very helpful. In-person contact, unfortunately, is also very important. So especially in the early stage of a startup, it's not enough to be just remote. But that doesn't mean that you have to be always in the same city, of course. But for a European startup, having only investors in the US would not be a good move, and vice versa, of course. As I said, I think another founder in Munich once told me about this beer test. Do you want to go for a beer with your investor? If that works, that helps.
Absolutely. And we always compare, the relationship between co-founders, but also between investors as like proper relationships, almost like marriages, right? So it's pretty much the same advice that you would give people who are in a couple, right? Communication, being very honest. So it applies to the business world as well. And last question for Sebastian, then we start opening the question to the Q&A. In what ways do you believe that venture capital, the venture capital ecosystem, can further contribute to advancing clean energy technologies?
From my point of view, so far the VC ecosystem in this space hasn't been courageous enough. So I think it's really about being courageous. It's about having a long-term principled view of the world. And then it's also about helping Europe. In Europe, we're amazing in research. We have, I think, about half of the world's leading research institutions are located in Europe. But what we've been, let's say, historically bad at is commercializing those ideas. So what we're trying to do, and I hope many others investors will also start doing, is trying to connect those dots and trying to bridge those information asymmetries and make sure that our industrial heritage, which is also something that we're great at in Europe, with all those family businesses, that there is a deeper connect between those different worlds, and also something that obviously Luca and the Rancilio team are doing. So I think that's exactly what we need to do.
Yeah, and we did a whole series on Italians in the Silicon Valley on the podcast, and there's so much to learn from that ecosystem, right? From how strong the university to the business partnership is, and we really need to learn a lot from the US in that way, because we do have some of the best institutions and researchers and scientists, but then unfortunately a lot of them then leave to the US, right, for the opportunities. So it's good that Francesco, you're not in Italy, but at least you're in Europe. So that's it's very good. So I'm going to open up the question. We have a first question from Filippo Palmieri for Francesco. Among all, which are the hardest challenges you're facing from a business standpoint? Funds, supply chain, talent, etc.
Feels strange to say it, but right now we're not limited in funds. Right now, fundraising at this stage, we think we are in the right place at the right time with the right people, let's say, but the people are never enough. So actually attracting more of the right talent, we have been very successful at hiring, but when you do 300 interviews for one position and you feel happier if you get to the end, but you feel like, okay, maybe 300 was a bit too many. So actually my founder experience is recruitment is a really big part of what you do. And yeah, this is not to say that there isn't the right kind of talent, of course. Maybe one challenge in the recruitment space is attracting senior engineers that tend to be in the European ecosystem with large corporates. And there is nothing wrong about working in the corporate world, but we have a preference culturally across Europe for stable jobs. This idea of stability is almost inexistent in the United States. And that means that we end up talking to people in the BMWs and the Volkswagen and whatnot. And some of those people don't think about startups. They don't consider it in the first place. So that's interesting. Maybe one final point, business standpoint. Of course, we are a venture that goes into the long term. And when you start, as Sebastian was saying, when you start thinking about tomorrow, it's one thing, but when you start thinking about 10 years down the line, you are in a different game. You're working every day on those milestones, but you also need to have a view of what is the product that you're really targeting. And then you're going into a space of opinions. There is no prediction in some sense that holds on. Is there going to be another Russian invasion of Ukraine that is going to send everyone nuts with energy prices and so on? So you prepare as much as you can, but that's challenging.
Of course. We have another question from Diego for Sebastian. How do you see the situation of the European VC ecosystem considering the current geopolitical scenario for 2024?
I have to say, I really I enjoy being a founder, being a VC at this point in time. I think it's actually the most exciting point in time. It's really where the heat is on, and where you will very quickly see who can stand the heat and who can't. So who is rather joining a large corporate or going back to consulting or to the banking world, and who's not sticking it out. So I think it's actually also taking a look at history that shows us that right now is probably the best time to start a company. And hence I'm happy that Francesco and the team, that they decided to do it.
There's been a report that Sifted, I think, just recently shared about how many founders are currently thinking of quitting their startups to go, as you said, back to like 39 or 49%, like a very high amount. So if you stick through the hard times, I'm sure there's going to be lots of success afterward. We have now a question, quite a long one from Massimo Ruffoni. I think this one is for Francesco. In a recent PitchBook report, there are 77 startups in the nuclear field, excluding the ones in stealth mode, 35 in the fusion domain, and 42 in the fission domain. Some are raising a lot of money, as reported recently in the news. How do you see the competition between the two fields in the medium-long run? And will there be space for both technology? Will there be a winner-takes-all business between different technologies?
Great question. So first of all, there is no reason to think really that there is a winner-takes-all. There is no winner-takes-all in gas, nor in coal, nor in any major technology. I think in the case for a specific technology like stellarators, I am a big believer in the fact that geopolitics will play in the long run, because we're talking about energy security at the end of the day. So I think Europe, not really sub-national countries, let's say in Europe, but Europe as a whole and the US and China, they will all want to develop their champions in all of these spaces. Now, in the question, there is this association of nuclear field, which is, of course, very understandable. Fission and fusion having fundamentally their source of energy in the transformation of mass into energy, that's nuclear energy. That said, the technologies involved are so radically different that it's a bit like putting together gas and coal and every chemical thing. So the risk profiles of different technologies are very different. The places in which they will find a market fit are likely going to be different. So I think there is no reason to think that there can be countries where both fusion and fission will coexist. That said, fission has actually been around for quite some time, and it's very attractive economically in some cases. The problem of fission, of course, is the social acceptance. It's the regulation profile due to the fact that fission is easy to do in the sense that there is a chain reaction. You have to really prevent accidents, which can be done as new fission startups are trying to show. But it's just two very different spaces from my perspective. If you could get fusion as clean, safe, abundant, hydrogen-based, basically, so as a source of energy, if it's cheap enough, there is no reason for anything else. I don't think you could say the same about fission, but I think all of these will find a place.
Thank you. Now a question from Stefania Rossetti for Sebastian. In your opinion, what are the human characteristics that a founder must have to be considered a good investment?
Let me call it pathologically crazy. In a good way. So I think it's really this nothing can stop you, radically high ambitions, long-term horizon on the one hand, and then combined with sales ability. You have to sell to yourself for a long time. You have to sell to your first employees, very important ones, and then the following. You have to sell to investors. You have to sell to partners. In the case of Francesco and Proxima Fusion, Bilfinger, for example, and a number of universities that have now also partnered with the company. So I think that's roughly speaking, that's the profile of a founder that we like. Very intrinsically motivated and slightly crazy. In a good way, Francesco.
I love the crazy. And Francesca Fetti is asking, is there some project that can be shared between your interests and the sustainability European plans? Do you think that this appeal can catch more interest from funds?
I definitely think that there is, of course, I consider what I do a sustainability field, but just a different timescale than the urgency that we have now for solutions right now. So I wouldn't put fusion in the same basket as photovoltaics, which are very high technology readiness and they should be deployed right now. But there are European programs that are being shaped to support fusion. It's useful to know that fusion so far in Europe has been only publicly supported. So the real change and the budget of Europe in fusion is not too bad, let's say. Depends what you compare it to. Let's say Europe has invested more in magnetic confinement fusion than the United States. That's a fact. How much, if we had invested more, maybe we would be more advanced, but that's a truism. It's the same in every field. What is changing now is that instead public-private partnerships are becoming a theme, let's say. I think it's a theme because it makes so much sense. Fundamentally, when you talk about climate scale challenges, if you manage to make the most of the public institutions that, as Sebastian was saying, are really the backbone, it's where we lead as a continent. If you manage to couple that with the venture speed and the ambition of a startup, which is attracted to a very different category of people and also to private investors, of course, then maybe you can accelerate. That's the claim, let's say. So Europe as a whole should really get deep into this, and I know that this is happening, so I am hopeful.
Next question comes from Christopher Soika for Francesco. In your current engineering design process, which developments are you most excited about, and what is currently giving you and your team the biggest headaches?
those superconductors. They're something of a different planet, and I think they will bring us to a different planet, quite literally, at some point. The engineering design process of these high-temperature superconducting magnets is a very multidisciplinary kind of problem. You have to keep this materials, these tapes of high-temperature superconducting material. You have to keep them at cryogenic conditions. You can only bend them in specific ways, and when you power this magnet, the forces are enough to lift 2 EPFLs. So you have this very coupled thermo-electrical and structural problem. I find it super interesting. Too bad that in my position, I don't get to spend that much time in the lab, but I know that my team is enjoying it and they're seeing the light at the end of the tunnel, meaning that if we actually manage to actually build that, everything changes. Biggest headaches, could mention some aspects of the structural challenges that exist. So you can't just increase the magnetic field of such a device ad infinitum. You actually, as I said, the forces here are enough to lift entire buildings. And so the steels don't exist to do this. There is no material that can hold certain things. So you have to come up with some solutions such that you balance forces in some way. So very, very interesting. From another headache, of course, is finding people that are not willing. There are plenty of people, it turns out, that are willing to jump into such an opportunity, but actually finding the ones that are just ready to go and that can contribute knowledge from different fields. So we're not only looking for the specialists in that specific field, but people that are adaptable, that bring expertise from different industries, not at all just from fusion, but from magnetic resonance imaging devices, from car industry. We've had some very interesting cases of Jean-Claude joined us from Tesla, where he was doing crash simulations of cars. And that somehow has a really nice analogy in the way you balance magnets and their forces. So these applications across fields are a headache and a really nice one.
Next question we have from Francesco Gadini. In the Tomorrow Fund investment thesis, you're adopting a contrarian approach with higher risk rewards bets compared to the typical VC profile. Managing these distinct mindsets as a GP in both the normal Visionaries Fund and the Tomorrow Fund involves unique strategies. How do you navigate these differences effectively? Furthermore, in breakthrough developments where the future cannot be forecasted but only discovered, how do you determine the right bets?
Great question. So I used to spend most of my time on the B2B SaaS side. So let's say on the more mainstream VC side. And then it was a very purposeful decision a couple of years ago to go back to my roots, also the scientific family roots. And I think it is very different. You have to be more long-term. You have to be more courageous in this space. You have to be more principles driven, I would say. And I'm probably in this rare zone that not many GPs are in, where I've also started and also successfully sold a company before. So I'm definitely not, say, short or even midterm oriented when it comes to financial rewards. I really look at it from a very long-term perspective, and I'm a big believer in what we're doing, and I also believe you can only do it if you have this long-term perspective. If you at some point, if you start compromising, if you start making, say, mid-term or let's say software bets, and you start mixing strategies, I don't think that would work. But it's really it's this focused approach that we believe in, this hypothesis-driven focused approach. It's this, say, reverse anthropology approach where we have a very clear picture of what the world will look like, probably according to us, in 10, 15, 20 years. And now we're investing in everything that's needed until then.
We have a final question from Andrea Cipriano. I believe you already touched upon a little bit about this topic, but maybe there's something else you want to add. Being a highly specific technology, how was your validation process for Proxima Fusion? Did you hire external advisors?
We sometimes do that. We didn't do it in this case. So we have a very extensive scientific network, which we used, as mentioned before, my co-founder Tong, he spent the last almost decade at Fraunhofer. He built up the technology transfer fund. So he knows all the 60 Fraunhofer institutes. He has the best connections to also Max Planck, etc. So we were talking to the leading scientists in this space, but then we also went straight to, say, the commercial side of things, speaking to the larger utilities, speaking to the regulatory bodies that will also be relevant, getting a clear view of what the follow-on funding landscape will look like. So not only being stuck in the moment and in the today, but also making sure that the tomorrow works out from a funding point of view. That's roughly how we did it in terms of the technology. Plus, as mentioned before, spending a lot of time with the team, and ultimately, those two things. That's what it boils down to: getting a clear grip on that, and then embedding that into what the competitive situation looks like. The different approaches that Francesco mentioned, with laser-based fusion, magnetic confinement fusion, tokamaks, stellarators, etc. Obviously, you have to maneuver that, and you have to get a very clear understanding, and then make those hypothesis-driven investment decisions that we then make.
Well, we got to the end, 1 hour, 1 minute, so really bang on time. Thank you so much, Francesco. Thank you so much, Sebastian, for sharing all of your expertise.
Thank you.
Really, really interesting conversation. Thank you for everyone who tuned in and for asking all those questions. We'll let everybody go to their dinners, afternoon, evenings. But yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks, Ines.
Thank you so much.
Have a good evening.